The Pike is an amusement zone site kind of thing that opened up in 1902 on the boardwalk of Long Beach, California. The Pike had a lot of different things there, but the one we're worried about today was Laugh in the Dark, which is a dark ride, which if you're not too familiar with what those are, they're basically these rides where you get into a cart and they go through this kind of course kind of thing, and just scary things pop out and scare you and things like that. Think of the Haunted Mansion at Disneyland if you've been there, but imagine if it was like actually scary, that kind of thing. Laugh in the Dark was a pretty standard ride in terms of scariness. It was liked by kids and adults equally, so it couldn't be like terrifying, but it also couldn't be a kind of kiddie ride, so somewhere in between. And the first few years were pretty good, but something started to be a common complaint among mostly kids, but I'm sure a lot of adults also found that to be a complaint. And this complaint was kind of centered around a particular mannequin that was hanging from a noose in this like gallows type display. Actually, in 2017, Mark Taylor, who if you didn't know, he worked on the prototypes for the He-Man toy line, which I think is pretty cool. I never had one myself, but you know, what's cool is cool, I guess. But he did an interview for the Netflix show The Toys That Made Us. I've seen it, it's not my thing, but anyway, he did an interview, and in this interview he said, and I quote, "Way back when I was 9, my dad decided to take us to the Pike Funhouse, and here's this real shady house of fear, and I didn't feel good about it. It smells like somebody's dead." And when the ride starts to take him closer to this hanging mannequin, I assume, were the one that everyone had been complaining about by this point, he said, "All of a sudden I knew this was a real person, no question. This was absolutely a real person." And again, that's his account. I'm sure there's tons of other people who maybe did interviews. I couldn't really find any, but that's the only one that actually stood out to me. And despite all these complaints about the smell and things like that, for some reason, no one decides to go check what the smell is or investigate the mannequin that people say smells rotten or do really anything about it. And those complaints would continue to just start piling up until December 8th, 1976. And that day is significant because the $6 million Man, which I've never seen, but I assume it's good if it costs that much to make. But it was filming an episode titled Carnival of Spies, very fitting name. And everything was going well while they were filming until they were starting to set up a scene where Mr. Expensive was supposed to be riding on the ride for a shot. And it seems that there's different accounts on what exactly led to, the event. Like some articles I read that the director wasn't happy with the position of the hanging mannequin and wanted it moved. Others say that someone from the prop team bumped into it, and then another said that someone from the prop team was going to move the mannequin to set it up in a different shot. So regardless of why, someone from the prop team was going to move the mannequin. That's the important part of like the story. And when the very unlucky prop man did move the mannequin, its arm fell off, just clean off. And from what I found, they did try to put it back together with like wax and stuff. And that's when, when he gave it one nice like look at it and he saw that it wasn't made of plastic or wax, but inside was legitimate just bone and decayed flesh. And as it turns out, this hanging mannequin that everyone had been complaining about was literally just a mummy. The police were called, obviously, and the mummy was taken to the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office, who had the annoyingly difficult task of figuring out where on earth this mummy came from and how it ended up in Laugh in the Dark. From what I could find, there's 3 things in particular that led to piecing together what exactly happened to the mummy and where it came from. The first 2 are sort of tied together like that, one being a copper bullet casing from the bullet that killed him, obviously, and it was found in his body, which that type of casing had been stopped being made years ago, so pretty big clue there. And the second was the initial embalming technique used to preserve the body initially, because by this point it had been covered in multiple layers of wax, but they could still see what the initial embalming technique was. And with those 2 things alone, the coroners assumed the body had to be from the early 20th century. But I think the third is probably the biggest breakthrough. Now, I'm going to preface this by saying that I did find this information on Ripley's Believe It or Not, which for the sake of the video, I'm going to assume that is true. I would understand if you don't believe, the source it came from. I assume that site just can't just make things up. But again, the next third thing, you can just choose to not believe it if you don't trust Ripley's Believe It or Not as a source. But like I said, for the sake of the video, I'm going to. But according to them, inside the mummy, or inside the mummy's mouth in particular, they found tickets to the Museum of Crime and a penny dated to 1924. And all these three, four-ish kind of things basically, but Point being, all these things help to start piece together a story of how this mummy arrived in Laugh at the Dark. In 1911, Elmer McCurdy was held up in a barn where the police had chased him to and were ready to arrest him for robbing a train. All he had really gotten from that train was about $46 and 2 jugs of whiskey. I'm not sure how much $46 would be currently, so I'll have Daniel throw that up on screen what the, adjustment for inflation will be. But I guess he was willing to die for it since after the cops shot their first shot, I assume he started firing back relentlessly. And eventually, as the firefight went on, police started to notice that he wasn't firing back anymore. And when they checked, they saw that he was dead. The body was taken to a funeral home, and I'm going to butcher this name, so Dan, could you throw up a proper pronunciation of this? But the body was found in Pawhuska, and after multiple tries of getting the word out, just trying to let everybody know, like, hey, we have this dude's body. Can anyone related to him, a wife, anything, can someone come claim him? And I guess no one really decided to do that because without a relative or spouse, they were sort of just stuck with his body. And I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt that money was just really tight at this funeral home because the undertaker had the grim idea to embalm Elmer and set him up to be shown off to the public so long as they paid a nickel, and this nickel would be inserted into his mouth. And see, there's disrespecting the dead, and then there's whatever this is supposed to be. But criminal or not, he would have had to be the worst criminal on earth to make this justifiable, at least in my eyes. But I could understand not feeling sympathy for him. I'm just saying this feels very mean-spirited, and from this point, it really only just starts to get worse for him. About 5 years into exploiting their human nickel generator, 2 men showed up and claimed that Elmer was a relative of theirs. The 2 relatives turned out to be liars, I know, shocker, and in actuality, they used the body as an attraction for their traveling carnival, and people would pay a few cents to see the body and just, I don't see, the thing that bothers me, but the thing that confuses me is what really was the goal here. Because it's a few cents, and I'm sure that meant a lot back then. So was it really worth it to just see a dead dude? I don't know. To me, I teach their own, I guess. They didn't have video games back then, so I'm sure this was the most exciting thing people had going for them. But the point being, after this point, the accounts start to get a little tricky to follow from here, since most of it is really just based on what either people remember or have told other people, or what you could find in like letters and things like that and so on. So a lot of it is kind of just, you can either believe it or you can either not believe it. Some of it is just extremely obviously a lie, and other things you can kind of make the argument for. But what is concrete is that there was a Los Angeles Times paper which included Elmer's body in a fun things to do in downtown list, and apparently anyone could go and, as I bet you expect, pay a few cents to see Elmer's body in an ornate coffin, which is very nice that by this point he had been upgraded into getting a coffin. So moving on up in the world, I guess. I know this is going to seem like a tangent, but just follow me here. A man by the name of Dan Sonny, who is a director and producer. If you haven't seen his movies, I don't blame you. Apparently they're not very good and they're pretty exploitive, but we'll leave that there. But he claims that at some point his dad purchased the corpse and coated it in wax. He then set it up in a coffin for their villains display at a freak show, and once these freak shows start to go out of style, Elmer was basically thrown into a warehouse to collect dust for about 20-ish years. I say claimed because I saw a few articles that said this, but I also saw a lot of articles that just straight up skipped everything I'm about to say. So it's, again, the pathway for the path of Elmer's body is really weird to follow and really interesting, because everything could kind of just be chalked up to either not even happening at all, or everything did happen exactly as it said, and it's just a insane way for a dead dude to travel for like 50 plus years without anybody thinking, are we assholes? But the important thing to know is that by this point, when Elmer had thrown it into the warehouse, the body was covered in at least 3 layers of wax plus the initial embalming. And once again, following the exact trail gets a little difficult because it seems to just jump from one person's hand to another in pretty quick succession. But from what I could find, the most definitive pathway that could be traced is that from that warehouse, the body was sold to the Hollywood Wax Museum, who used it for a few years, maybe rented it out every so often, but they ended up selling it to a cheaper wax museum, I presume because it smelled like shit. But anyway, that cheaper museum ended up shutting down and went out of business around the 1970s. And I assume because after businesses go not out of business, they typically sell a lot of their crap. So I feel like that is how somehow the body ended up making its way to the Pike in Long Beach, California, more specifically at the Laugh in the Dark, where once it was fully set up, it was hung from a gallows display for their spooky, weird ride. And despite how tame that ride probably and comparatively probably is, it gets extremely horrifying and kind of gross when you take into account that a straight up real, nearly 50-year-old mummy was just hanging in full sight of everyone, adults and kids alike. And that sort of loops us all the way back in like a nice little circle back to when people were just complaining like, hey, this thing smells like shit. So that's kind of where the story ends, and it's honestly just a wild and grim turn of events that probably could have been avoided if the initial undertaker who handled Elmer's body wasn't a huge piece of shit. But money's money, so you know, I guess you can't blame him if he really thought he needed that money. But to each their own. I know I promised part 2 of the Iceberg video, and I really did try to get that out today. There's just a lot of research and editing that goes into making a video that long. Plus, I really do try to do the research pretty thoroughly and try to get as much factual information as I could find, like on my own, obviously. And because I do want to pay, like, obviously, since you were dealing with people who are, you know, missing, and these are real people, you do try and want to be as respectful as possible while also getting this information out there. And you know, that's what I mean. So those videos take a lot longer. I think the initial one, it's hard to tell because the videos don't usually get uploaded once they're made, aside from this one. And so that video was kind of like 3-ish, 4-ish weeks of just straight researching and effort. So, I mean, I haven't even sent Daniel any recordings for that video yet. Have I, Daniel? And so that's what I mean is that those videos just take a lot longer. So we'll probably get some shorter videos in between there as me and my editor Daniel work on those in the background, which I hope you guys are okay with, because I feel like as me and Daniel work better and start being a better big old team, those videos will by default start to show a nice gradual increase in quality, and that's the goal. So we're gonna see what we can do. Like I said, I'm gonna give it all the time it needs to breathe, and at least try to make sure that every time one of those Iceberg tier videos comes out, the quality has at least taken a significant enough jump to make the wait worth it. And I don't know if you can tell, but me and Dan were rushing a bit to finish the last one, me in particular. And I feel like when you watch the like latter half of that Iceberg video in the final cut, you really can feel the rush in the way I'm talking and things. And so there will be a video next week. You'll just have to figure out what video that's going to be. And I think, personally, it's good to have some surprises in your life. So don't worry too much. Just make sure you come back. But that's about it. Later.